Some souls are meant to walk alone, carrying the weight of endless years like stones in their hearts. Lord Darius Blackmoor knows this truth better than most. 800 years of solitude have taught him that love is a luxury he cannot afford. The ancient vampire rules his clan from the crumbling towers of Ravenscroft Manor, feared and respected, but never truly known. He has watched the world change around him while remaining unchanged himself, a virgin to the sacred mate bond that defines his kind. Then one misty dawn, everything shifts. A dying woman collapses at his gates, clutching a pendant that glows in his presence. She remembers nothing, not her name, not her past. But as Darius nurses her back to life, he feels something impossible awakening within his cold heart. Could this mysterious stranger be the mate he never dared hope for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient stones of Ravenscroft Manor had witnessed 8 centuries of secrets, their weathered surfaces holding memories that most mortals could never comprehend. Lord Darius Blackmoor moved through his ancestral halls with the fluid grace of a predator, though tonight his usual purposeful stride held an unfamiliar hesitancy. The heavy oak doors groaned on their hinges as he passed, echoes of his footsteps swallowed by the vast emptiness that had become his constant companion. Carved into the great hall's central wall, the Blackmoor family crest stood as a testament to noble vampire heritage, a raven with outstretched wings perched atop a crescent moon, surrounded by intricate Celtic knotwork that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. The sigil had watched over his bloodline for generations, its presence both comforting and burdensome. Tonight, as Darius paused before it, the weight of those 800 years pressed against his shoulders like a physical force. "My lord," came a familiar voice from the shadows. Marcus emerged from the servants' corridor, his weathered face bearing the marks of decades spent in service to the Blackmoor line. Though human, he had served as Darius's most trusted thrall for nearly 40 years, aging gracefully under the vampire's protection. "The eastern chambers have been prepared as you requested." Darius nodded, his steel-grey eyes reflecting depths that spoke of centuries lived and witnessed. "How does she fare?" "Still unconscious, but her breathing has steadied." Marcus's expression carried the careful neutrality of one who had learned not to question his master's decisions, yet concern flickered in his aging eyes. "Celeste has examined her thoroughly. The wounds are healing at an unusual rate for a mortal." The mention of his advisor drew Darius's attention toward the grand staircase, where Celeste descended with her characteristic poise. She had been his companion through 3 centuries of clan leadership, turned during the Renaissance, when political intrigue among vampire nobility reached its peak. Her auburn hair caught the firelight as she approached, emerald eyes sharp with intelligence and wariness. "Darius," she said, dispensing with formal titles as she always did when they were alone. "We need to discuss what you've brought into our home." He turned from the family crest, his expression unreadable. "She was dying at our gates. Would you have me leave her to the wolves? That's not what concerns me." Celeste moved closer, her voice dropping to the low tones they used for sensitive matters. "I've never encountered a mortal whose blood carries such an unusual scent. It's not entirely human, yet it's not vampire either. There's something ancient about her, something that makes my instincts sing warnings." The great hall fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the massive stone fireplace. Darius had ruled his clan through careful consideration and measured responses, never acting on impulse. Yet when he had found the woman collapsed against his iron gates, something primal within him had overridden 8 centuries of caution. "Tell me about the pendant," he said, settling into one of the leather chairs near the fire. The furniture had been crafted in an era when comfort meant solid construction rather than modern softness, each piece built to last through the long years of vampire existence. Celeste exchanged a meaningful glance with Marcus before taking the seat across from him. It's not of any design I recognize, and my studies have covered most supernatural artifacts from the past millennium. The metal appears to be silver, yet it doesn't affect her as it would a vampire. More concerning is its reaction to your presence. Explain. When you carried her inside, the pendant pulsed with an inner light. Not the cold glow of enchantment, but something warmer. Almost like, she paused, choosing her words carefully, like recognition. Darius leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. In all his years, he had encountered artifacts of power, relics of ancient vampire nobility, weapons forged in supernatural fires. None had ever reacted to him personally. His strength came from bloodline and experience, not mystical connections. Have you been able to determine anything else about her condition? Marcus stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture he adopted when delivering reports. No identification, no belongings save for the pendant and the torn dress she wore, but there are details that don't align with a common vagrant. Her hands show no signs of hard labor, her teeth are remarkably well maintained, and beneath the dirt and exhaustion she carries herself like someone accustomed to comfort. Or authority, Celeste added quietly. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney as Darius considered this information. Throughout his long existence, he had learned to trust the instincts that had kept him and his clan alive through political upheavals, wars, and the constant undercurrents of vampire society. Those same instincts now whispered that the woman upstairs represented something far more significant than a chance encounter. The clan expects answers, Celeste continued, her tone gentle but firm. Word has already spread among the inner circle that you've brought an outsider into Ravenscroft. Some are questioning whether this departure from protocol suggests, she hesitated, whether your long isolation might be affecting your judgment. A lesser vampire might have bristled at such directness, but Darius had long valued Celeste's honesty over flattery. He rose from his chair and moved to the tall windows that offered a view of the mist-shrouded grounds. Dawn approached, though the heavy clouds would allow him to remain active longer than usual. "I've never claimed a mate," he said, the words carrying more weight than their simple construction suggested. "For 8 centuries, I've watched others find their bonds, seen the joy and the inevitable pain that follows. The clan has accepted this choice." "They have," Celeste agreed, "but they've also never seen you act with such spontaneous compassion. The Darius Blackmoor they know would have ensured she received medical attention at the nearest human settlement. He would not have carried her into the inner sanctum of Ravenscroft Manor." Marcus cleared his throat softly. "If I may, my lord, there are also practical concerns. The staff is devoted to your service, but they're unsettled by the presence of an unknown mortal within these walls. Some fear she might be a hunter or spy." The suggestion was not unreasonable. Vampire hunters had grown more sophisticated over the centuries, and infiltration attempts were not unheard of among the noble houses. Yet, when Darius recalled the weight of the woman in his arms, the peaceful expression on her unconscious face, he felt only a deep certainty that she represented no threat, at least, not the kind his people feared. "Double the perimeter watches," he decided, "but make no move against her until we learn more. I want to speak with her when she wakes. And if she proves hostile..." Celeste's question carried the weight of centuries spent protecting their vampire enclave. Darius turned from the window, his expression resolute. "Then I will deal with the consequences of my choice. But I will not act from fear of what might be." The conversation was interrupted by soft footsteps on the stone stairs. Sarah, one of the younger human servants, descended with quick, nervous steps. "My lord," she said, offering a quick curtsy, "the lady stirs. I thought you would want to know immediately." Something within Darius's chest tightened, an unfamiliar sensation that he had no name for. He had lived through centuries without experiencing the quickening of pulse that mortals associated with anticipation, yet now he found himself eager to look upon the woman's face when consciousness returned to her eyes. "Thank you, Sarah. Please ensure she has fresh water and something light to eat when she's ready." He paused, considering. "And Sarah, discretion regarding our guest is appreciated." "Of course, my lord." As the servant retreated, Darius made his way toward the east wing, Celeste falling into step beside him. The hallways of Ravenscroft had been designed to accommodate vampire senses. Sound carried differently through the stone corridors, allowing inhabitants to move with awareness of activity throughout the manor. Now, that design seemed to amplify the significance of each footfall as they approached the guest chambers. "Darius," Celeste said as they reached the heavy wooden door, "whatever connection you feel to this woman, remember that you've spent 8 centuries building walls around your heart for good reason. Some of those reasons haven't changed, simply because a mysterious stranger appeared at our gates." He considered her words, hand resting on the iron door handle. Celeste spoke from experience and genuine concern for his welfare. She had witnessed his early years as clan leader, seen the mistakes that had shaped his cautious nature. She had also seen the gradual retreat from emotional connection that had defined his approach to immortal existence. "I'm aware of the risks," he replied quietly, "but for the first time in centuries, I find myself curious about tomorrow rather than simply enduring it." Before she could respond, he opened the door and stepped into the chamber where the mysterious woman lay, still and silent, the pendant at her throat catching the first pale light of dawn. The chamber held the quiet stillness that precedes awakening, broken only by the soft whisper of fabric against skin as the woman stirred beneath the heavy coverlets. Darius stood in the doorway, his enhanced senses cataloguing every detail, the gradual deepening of her breathing, the flutter of eyelashes against pale cheeks, the subtle shift in her heartbeat as consciousness returned. When her eyes opened, they were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of silver that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, gaze unfocused, as awareness slowly filtered through the haze of exhaustion and healing. Then her attention found him, and Darius felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not of her face, which remained a mystery, but of something deeper, more fundamental. She should have been afraid. Every instinct honed through centuries of dealing with mortals told him that a human, waking in an unfamiliar place, faced with a vampire's predatory stillness, would react with terror. Instead, she regarded him with curious calm, as though his presence brought comfort rather than threat. "You saved me," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that often marked those of noble birth, though roughened by recent hardship. "I remember falling, and then darkness, but I remember your voice, pulling me back." Darius entered the chamber fully, moving with deliberate care to avoid startling her. "You collapsed at my gates during the night. You were near death from exposure and exhaustion." She attempted to sit up, wincing as movement reminded her of her body's recent trauma. Without thinking, Darius crossed the distance between them, offering his hand for support. The moment their skin touched, her pendant flared with brilliant light, casting dancing shadows across the chamber walls. Both froze at the phenomenon, staring at the artifact that now pulsed with steady luminescence against her throat. The pendant was unlike anything Darius had encountered, not the cold fire of enchanted silver, but something warmer, more alive. As they watched, a small crystalline fragment detached from its surface, floating for a moment in the air before settling onto the coverlet between them. "What?" she began, then stopped as her fingers closed around the crystal. Her eyes rolled back, and for a terrifying moment, Darius thought she might lose consciousness again. Instead, when her gaze returned to his, it held the weight of memory, fragmented but unmistakably real. "I see a great hall, filled with nobles in ancient dress. There's music and laughter, and She gasped, releasing the crystal as though it burned. I see you. Younger, somehow, but unmistakably you. How is that possible? The question hung between them like a blade, sharp with implications that Darius wasn't prepared to examine. In 800 years, no artifact had ever shown him visions of his past, nor had any mortal demonstrated the ability to share such experiences through touch alone. "What do you remember of yourself?" he asked, settling carefully into the chair beside her bed. "Your name, your family, how you came to be at my gates." Her brow furrowed with concentration, and he watched emotions play across her expressive features. Frustration, fear, and underneath it all, a growing sense of loss. Nothing. It's as though my life began the moment I woke in this room. Everything before that is empty. She raised her hand to touch the pendant, then hesitated. Except for this. When I hold it, I feel connected to something ancient and important. And when you're near, it responds as though recognizing an old friend. Darius leaned forward slightly, drawn by the earnestness in her voice. "Do you fear me? You should, you know. I'm not human, and my kind are not known for their mercy toward mortals who stumble into their domains." A smile ghosted across her lips, the first he had seen since her awakening. "I know what you are. I can sense the predator beneath your gentleman's manner, feel the weight of centuries in your gaze. But fear you? No. I feel," she paused, searching for the right words, "as though I've been searching for you without knowing it." The admission hung in the air between them, both too honest and too impossible to dismiss easily. Darius found himself studying her face with new intensity, looking for some clue to explain the profound sense of rightness he felt in her presence. She was beautiful, certainly, with classical features that spoke of good breeding, but beauty alone had never moved him. Something else drew him to her, something that resonated in the deepest parts of his immortal soul. "We should discuss practical matters," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "You'll need clothing, food, time to recover your strength. My servants can provide whatever you require. You're being very kind to a stranger with no memory and no means to repay your hospitality." Perhaps kindness isn't the only motivation. The honest admission surprised them both. Darius had built his reputation on careful words and measured responses, never revealing more than necessary. Yet, with this woman, this mystery, who looked at him as though he were more than the feared vampire lord of ancient bloodline, he found himself speaking truths he had shared with no one. "The pendant," she said quietly, "it's trying to tell us something, isn't it? These visions, the way it responds to your presence, it's not coincidence." Before he could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. Celeste's voice carried through the heavy door, tight with urgency. "Darius, forgive the intrusion, but we have visitors, representatives from 3 major houses, and they're asking about unusual supernatural activity in our territory." The woman, he realized he didn't even know what to call her, caught the tension in his posture immediately. "Is that dangerous?" "Potentially." He rose from the chair, mind already shifting to the political implications. Vampire noble houses didn't make unannounced visits without serious cause. If they were investigating supernatural disturbances, her arrival and the pendant's behavior might have attracted unwanted attention. "I need to handle this, but we're not finished with our conversation." She nodded, though worry clouded her features. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him at the threshold. "Darius, that is your name, isn't it? Whatever happens, I want you to know that waking up in your care feels like the first true safety I've ever known. Even if I can't remember anything else, I'm certain of that." He looked back at her, seeing strength beneath the vulnerability, determination beneath the confusion. Whatever forces had brought her to his gates, whatever mysteries surrounded her forgotten past, he found himself unwilling to let her go. The realization should have troubled him, should have triggered the protective instincts that had kept him isolated for centuries. Instead, it felt like the first genuine emotion he had experienced in longer than he cared to calculate. "Rest," he said simply. "We'll find answers to these questions, I promise you that." As he closed the door behind him, Darius reflected on how dramatically his world had shifted in the span of a single night. For 800 years, his existence had followed predictable patterns: duty, solitude, and the careful maintenance of power. Now, with 3 words spoken in a voice that somehow felt like coming home, everything had changed. The woman with storm-grey eyes and no memory had awakened something in him that he had believed permanently dormant. Whether that awakening would prove to be salvation or destruction remained to be seen, but for the first time in centuries, Darius Blackmoor found himself eagerly anticipating the answer. Down the corridor, Celeste waited with barely contained impatience, and beyond her, representatives of vampire nobility who might view his mysterious guest as either opportunity or threat. But as he walked away from the chamber where she rested, Darius carried with him the memory of her pendants, warm light, and the impossible recognition he had seen in her eyes. Whatever came next, he would face it with the knowledge that his long isolation had finally been broken by someone who looked at him and saw not the feared vampire lord, but simply a soul who had been waiting far too long to be found. 3 days had passed since the woman's awakening, and Ravenscroft Manor had settled into an uneasy rhythm around its mysterious guest. She had taken the name Elena, claiming it felt familiar on her tongue, though she could not say why. Darius found himself drawn to her company in ways that defied his centuries of careful isolation, spending evening hours in conversation that revealed both her quick intelligence and the frustrating gaps in her memory. Tonight, he discovered her in his private library, a vast chamber lined floor to ceiling with tomes collected across 8 centuries of existence. She stood before a particular shelf, her fingers trailing along the leather spines with obvious familiarity. What caught his attention, however, was the ancient bloodline tome, a repository of vampire genealogies that had remained stubbornly blank for decades, now glowing with faint luminescence at her proximity. "The organization system is quite logical," Elena said without turning around. "Ancient histories by region, genealogical records by house affiliation, and philosophical treatises arranged chronologically. Though I notice some sections seem to be missing volumes." Darius paused in the doorway, struck by her casual familiarity with a cataloguing system that had taken him decades to establish. Most of those missing volumes were destroyed during the vampire purges of the 14th century. Knowledge deemed too dangerous for survival. She turned to face him, candlelight casting warm shadows across her features. In the 3 days since her awakening, she had regained much of her physical strength, though the mystery of her identity remained as opaque as ever. Sarah had provided her with a simple dress of deep blue wool that complemented her grey eyes, and Elena moved with an unconscious grace that spoke of excellent breeding. "Your collection includes some very rare texts," she observed, gesturing toward a section of books bound in midnight leather. "I recognize several titles that most scholars believe were lost centuries ago. And how would you recognize such things, given your current circumstances?" Elena's expression grew thoughtful, and she moved closer to the bloodline tome, which pulsed more brightly as she approached. "I don't know. When I look at these books, I feel familiarity, as though I've spent considerable time in libraries of this caliber, but I can't recall when or where." She reached toward the tome, then hesitated. "This one feels different, almost as though it's alive and aware of my presence." "The bloodline tome has been in my family for 6 centuries, Darius explained, moving to stand beside her. "It records the genealogies and histories of noble vampire houses, but most of its pages have been blank for decades." The magic that once sustained its knowledge appears to have faded. Elena's fingers hovered over the leather binding. "May I?" At his nod, she opened the ancient book, and both of them stared in amazement as words began appearing on previously blank pages. Not the common tongue, but the formal script of ancient vampire nobility, flowing across the parchment as though written by an invisible hand. "The Valerian bloodline," Elena read aloud, her pronunciation of the archaic language perfect despite her amnesia. "First house of the Northern Territories, keepers of the ancient covenants, rulers by birthright, and guardians of the sacred bonds." She looked up at Darius with wonder. "Why is it showing me this particular lineage?" Before he could respond, footsteps in the corridor announced Celeste's approach. His advisor entered the library with Marcus close behind, both wearing expressions of barely contained concern. "Darius," Celeste said, her voice tight with urgency, "we've received disturbing news from our border watchers. 3 separate reports of rogue vampires operating in the surrounding territories, all within the past week. They appear to be searching for something or someone." Elena's hand moved instinctively to her pendant, which had begun to emit its characteristic warm glow. The gesture did not go unnoticed by either Celeste or Marcus, whose expressions grew more troubled. "What manner of searching?" Darius asked, though he suspected the answer would not be reassuring. "Aggressive questioning of mortal settlements," Marcus reported. "They're asking about strangers, particularly women traveling alone. Several witnesses described them as asking specifically about the lost bloodline and she who bears the ancient mark." Elena's face paled at these words, and Darius felt a protective instinct surge within him that was both unfamiliar and undeniable. The connection between her arrival and the sudden appearance of rogue vampires seemed too obvious to dismiss as coincidence. "There's more," Celeste continued, her gaze shifting between Darius and Elena. "The visiting nobles from yesterday's meeting have extended their stay. They claim to be investigating reports of unusual supernatural phenomena in our territory. Lord Aldrich specifically mentioned sensing awakening power that bears investigation." "Aldrich is not known for idle curiosity," Darius observed. "Lord Aldrich commanded one of the most powerful vampire houses in the Eastern Territories, and his interest in supernatural phenomena typically meant political opportunities or threats. Did he specify the nature of this awakening power?" "He was deliberately vague, but he did mention that certain ancient bloodlines carry signatures that can be detected across considerable distances when they begin to manifest." Celeste's meaningful look toward Pa. Elena made her implications clear. Elena closed the bloodline tome, though it continued to glow softly beneath her touch. "I'm the cause of these disturbances, aren't I? My presence here has put you and your people at risk. We don't yet know what you are," Darius said carefully, "but your presence has certainly triggered responses we don't fully understand. The question is whether we face those challenges together or separately." "Together," Elena said without hesitation. "If I'm truly connected to this Valerian bloodline," the tome revealed, "then running will only delay the inevitable confrontation. Besides," she turned to face him fully, "I meant what I said before. This is the first place I've felt safe, even if I can't remember ever feeling unsafe elsewhere." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's hurried entrance. "My lord, forgive me, but there's been an incident at the eastern gates. The guards report that a mortal woman approached the perimeter, claiming urgent business with the lady who bears the pendant. When challenged, she collapsed, and they found evidence of vampire bite marks." Elena's hand flew to her pendant, which flared with brilliant light at the mention of the attack. "Someone's been hurt because of me." "Not because of you," Darius corrected firmly. "Because of forces that view you as valuable enough to harm innocents in their search. There's a distinction." Celeste stepped forward, her expression resolute. The safest course would be to determine exactly what Elena represents before these rogue vampires locate our stronghold. If she's truly of Valerian lineage, then her presence here involves politics that extend far beyond our individual safety. Elena looked around the library at the glowing tome, at the faces of people who had sheltered her despite the growing danger, at Darius, whose steady presence had become her anchor in a sea of forgotten memories. "Then we'd better learn the truth quickly," she said with quiet determination, "because I won't be responsible for more innocent blood being spilled while we hesitate." Darius found himself admiring her courage, even as worry gnawed at his consciousness. Whatever Elena's true heritage, whatever powers lay dormant within her, the forces seeking her were growing bolder and more desperate. The sanctuary of Ravenscroft Manor, which had protected his clan for centuries, might not prove sufficient against enemies who viewed her as worth any cost to obtain. The wounded woman lay in one of the servant quarters, her pale features drawn with pain and exhaustion. Elena knelt beside her bed, one hand gently touching the stranger's forehead, while the other clasped her pendant. The artifact's warm glow seemed to ease the woman's distress, though the vampire bite marks on her neck remained angry and inflamed. "Her name is Margaret," Elena said softly as Darius entered the chamber. "She's been searching for me, though she doesn't understand why. The dreams started a fortnight ago, visions of a woman with a glowing pendant who would restore the ancient ways." Darius studied the unconscious woman, noting the quality of her clothing beneath the travel stains. "She's not a common villager. Her hands show no signs of hard labor, and her speech patterns suggest education. She mentioned a family name, Ashford. Does that mean anything to you?" The name struck Darius like a physical blow. He moved to the window, gazing out at the mist-shrouded grounds while memories stirred. The Ashford family served House Valeria for over 2 centuries. They were among the most trusted human allies of the vampire nobility, keepers of ancient lore and guardians of bloodline secrets. Elena's sharp intake of breath drew his attention back to her. "House Valeria, the same bloodline the tome revealed when I touched it. The very same." Darius turned from the window, his expression grave. "If Margaret carries Ashford blood, and she's been drawn to you through visions, then the connections run deeper than we initially suspected." As if summoned by their conversation, Celeste appeared in the doorway carrying an ornate silver compass. The instrument spun wildly in her hands, its needle pointing unerringly toward Elena, regardless of how Celeste moved. "I found this among your father's belongings," she told Darius, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "The lunar compass, crafted to point toward one's true mate. It's been dormant for centuries, but now it reacts to Elena's presence." Darius finished, staring at the spinning needle with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. Elena rose from Margaret's bedside, her grey eyes wide with realization. "All these artifacts, these reactions, they're not random, are they? Something about me is awakening things that have been dormant." "Or someone," Darius corrected quietly. "The question is whether you're awakening them or they're awakening you." Before Elena could respond, Margaret stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open. When her gaze found Elena, relief flooded her features. "My lady," she whispered, attempting to rise despite her weakness. "I knew you would come. The dreams showed me you bear the pendant of House Valeria, the key to restoring what was lost." "I don't understand," Elena said, gently pressing Margaret back against the pillows. "What was lost? What am I supposed to restore?" Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as though Elena's presence itself provided healing. "The unity, my lady. Before the Great Sundering, vampire houses worked in harmony. Your bloodline held the covenant that bound them together. When House Valeria fell, the peace died with it." Darius felt the weight of centuries pressing against his consciousness. He had lived through the aftermath of House Valeria's destruction, witnessed the political chaos that followed, the endless conflicts between noble houses that had defined vampire society for generations. If Elena truly carried Valerian blood, her existence represented possibilities he had never dared to contemplate. "How do you know these things?" he asked Margaret, settling into the chair beside her bed. "The knowledge passes through the Ashford line, my lord. Each generation learns the histories, memorizes the bloodlines, waits for the signs that the exile might end." She turned her attention back to Elena. "Your pendant, may I see it more closely?" Elena hesitated, then lifted the artifact from around her neck. As Margaret's fingers touched the silver surface, both women gasped. Elena's eyes rolled back, and when they refocused, they held depths of memory that had not been there moments before. "I remember," Elena whispered, her voice carrying new authority. "Not everything, but fragments. A great hall filled with representatives from every major house, treaties being signed, oaths being sworn. And I was there, not as a guest, but as their lady," Margaret confirmed. "The last daughter of House Valeria, heir to the Covenant throne." The revelation settled over the chamber like a shroud, heavy with implications. Darius found himself studying Elena with new eyes, seeing in her bearing and natural grace the echoes of the noble bloodline he had known centuries ago. Yet beneath the growing understanding lay a deeper, more personal realization. "If you are indeed Elena Valeria," he said carefully, "then your presence here involves more than coincidence. The lunar compass doesn't simply point to any vampire nobility, it specifically identifies one's destined mate." Elena met his gaze steadily, the pendant glowing brighter in her hands. "And what does that mean for us? For your clan, your carefully maintained isolation?" Before he could answer, the chamber's temperature dropped noticeably, and the candles flickered despite the absence of any breeze. Margaret whimpered in fear, while Elena instinctively moved closer to Darius. The barriers around the manor are weakening, he realized, his enhanced senses detecting the subtle wrongness in the air. Something or someone is testing our defenses. As if, in response to his words, a mental voice touched Elena's consciousness, cold and malevolent. "We know you're there, little princess. You cannot hide behind stone walls forever. The exile ends now, whether you will it or not." Elena staggered, and Darius caught her before she could fall. Through their physical connection, he felt the echo of the mental intrusion, a psychic assault from a vampire of considerable power. "They've found us," Elena said, her face pale but determined. "Whoever sent those rogue vampires, they're here." Darius helped her to steady herself, acutely aware of how natural the protective gesture felt. "Then we face them together. But first, we need to understand exactly what you're capable of. If you truly are of Valerian blood, then you possess abilities that extend far beyond anything I've witnessed." Margaret struggled to sit up. "My lady, there are things you must know before you face them, secrets that even the Ashford line guarded carefully. Your heritage carries both great power and terrible responsibility." Elena nodded, her hand finding Darius's with unconscious trust. "Then tell us quickly, because whatever's coming, I won't let it destroy the sanctuary you've provided me or harm the people who've shown me such kindness." As the night deepened around Ravenscroft Manor, 3 centuries of careful isolation crumbled beneath the weight of destiny and the growing certainty that Elena's presence had awakened forces that would reshape the vampire world forever. Margaret's revelations had taken most of the night, her voice growing stronger as she shared the carefully guarded secrets of the Ashford lineage. Now, as dawn approached, Elena stood in the manor's healing chamber, her hands glowing with soft golden light as she placed them over the dying form. Thomas, a young servant who had been found collapsed in the stables. I don't understand how this is possible, Elena murmured, watching in amazement as the man's labored breathing eased and color returned to his pale cheeks. I feel the life force within him responding to something in me, but I have no memory of ever healing anyone before, Darius observed from the doorway, his expression thoughtful. Since Margaret's arrival, Elena's latent abilities had begun manifesting with increasing frequency and power. The servant's mysterious illness, which had baffled both human physicians and vampire knowledge, was responding to her touch in ways that defied explanation. Valerian healing was legendary, he said quietly, entering the chamber as Elena stepped back from the now sleeping Thomas. Your ancestors were said to possess the ability to mend not just physical wounds, but spiritual damage as well. It's part of what made them natural leaders. People gravitated toward those who could literally heal their pain. Elena flexed her fingers, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. But if I possess such abilities, why do I remember none of it? Why does everything about my past remain so frustratingly blank? Before Darius could respond, Celeste burst into the chamber, her usual composure shattered. We have a problem, she announced breathlessly. Representatives from 4 major houses have arrived unannounced, demanding an immediate audience. They're claiming jurisdiction over matters of bloodline succession and threatening to search the manor if we don't cooperate. The golden light around Elena's hands flickered and died as tension replaced the calm focus needed for healing. They're here because of me, aren't they? Lord Aldrich leads them, Celeste continued, but he's accompanied by representatives from houses Ravenscroft, Nightshade, and Thornfield. Together, they command enough political power to challenge even our ancient territorial rights. Darius moved protectively closer to Elena, his mind already calculating the political ramifications. 4 major houses acting in concert suggested coordination at the highest levels of vampire nobility either. They viewed Elena as an extraordinary opportunity or an unprecedented threat. What are their specific demands? He asked. They want to examine what they term the Valerian artifact and question any individual claiming connection to the lost bloodline. Lord Aldrich was quite specific that sheltering such an individual without proper notification to the council constitutes a violation of inter-house protocols. Elena's pendant began to pulse with agitated light, and around the chamber, several items that had never shown magical properties began to resonate in response. A crystal paperweight on Thomas's bedside table started glowing, while a silver mirror on the far wall reflected light that wasn't there. This is escalating beyond our ability to control, Darius realized, watching as Elena's unconscious power awakened responses throughout the room. Your presence isn't just attracting individual attention, you're triggering reactions in objects that have been dormant for centuries. As if summoned by their discussion, Marcus appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave with concern. My lord, there's been a development at the gates. A woman claiming to be from House Nightshade requests immediate sanctuary, and she bears what appears to be fragments of an ancient crown. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The crown fragments, I've been dreaming about them, pieces of silver and sapphire that belong to... She pressed her hands to her temples as memory struggled to surface. To Queen Valeria, my ancestor. Without warning, Elena's power surged outward in a wave of golden energy that washed through the manor. Every vampire-touched artifact in Ravenscroft responded. Ancient weapons hummed with renewed enchantment. Protective wards flared to life, and most dramatically, the shattered crown fragments in the possession of the woman at their gates began to pulse with brilliant light, visible even from the healing chamber's windows. Dear gods, Celeste whispered, staring at the responding magical phenomena throughout the room. Elena, you're not just awakening individual items, you're calling to every piece of Valerian heritage still in existence. The realization struck them all simultaneously. Elena's growing power wasn't simply healing or defensive. She was unconsciously gathering the scattered remnants of her ancestral legacy, drawing them to her like metal filings to a magnet. "The crown fragments," Elena said, her voice carrying new authority and certainty. "They're the key to something important. I can feel them calling to me, wanting to be whole again." Darius found himself torn between admiration for Elena's growing strength and fear for her safety. "If you restore the crown of Valeria, every vampire house in existence will view you as either a savior or a threat to their independence. There will be no neutral ground." "There already isn't," Elena replied with quiet determination. "The moment I stepped through your gates, we entered a conflict that began centuries before either of us was born. The only choice now is whether we face it reactively or take control of the situation." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of their unwanted guests, led by Lord Aldrich's commanding presence. Through the manor's stone walls, Elena could sense the political tension radiating from the assembled vampire: nobility, anticipation, fear, ambition, and underneath it all, desperate hope for resolution to conflicts that had shaped their society for generations. "They're coming," she said unnecessarily as the footsteps grew closer. Darius positioned himself between Elena and the doorway, his protective instincts overriding political place. "Caution. Whatever happens, remember that you have choices. You don't owe them explanations, allegiances, or sacrifices simply because of your bloodline." Elena smiled at him, and in that expression he saw both the vulnerable woman who had awakened in his chambers days ago and the emerging queen she was destined to become. "Thank you for reminding me of that. But if I truly am the last daughter of House Valeria, then perhaps it's time I stopped running from that responsibility." As Lord Aldrich's voice echoed through the corridor, demanding immediate audience with the individual claiming Valerian heritage, Elena's pendant flared with brilliant light. The crown fragments at their gates responded in kind, and throughout the manor, 8 centuries of accumulated magical artifacts awakened in recognition of their returning queen. The moment of decision had arrived, and with it, the end of Darius's carefully maintained isolation from the broader vampire world. Whether Elena's emergence would bring salvation or chaos to their kind remained to be seen, but there was no longer any doubt that her presence would reshape everything they thought they knew about power, politics, and the bonds that tied immortal hearts together. The great hall of Ravenscroft Manor had not hosted a gathering of vampire nobility in over 3 centuries, yet tonight it thrummed with political tension as representatives from 4 major houses arranged themselves according to ancient protocols. Lord Aldrich commanded the centre position, his silver hair and predatory grace marking him as one of the elder vampires whose influence stretched across continents. Flanking him were Lords Ravenscroft, Nightshade, and Thornfield, each radiating the controlled power that came with centuries of rule. Elena entered the hall wearing the deep blue gown Sarah had provided, but she moved with a regal bearing that transformed simple wool into something approaching royal attire. At her throat, the pendant pulsed with steady light, and in her hands she carried the crown fragments that had been delivered by the Nightshade representative, 7 pieces of ancient silver and sapphire that seemed to sing with recognition at her touch. Darius walked slightly behind her, his presence both protective and supportive. As they approached the assembled nobility, ethereal chains seemed to materialize around him, not visible to the others, but Elena could sense them clearly. They were bonds forged of old pain and fear, the weight of losses that had taught him to avoid emotional vulnerability. "You claim to be Elena Valeria Nightshade." "Lord," Aldrich said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "Yet the records show that House Valeria was extinguished 8 centuries past." Their bloodline ended with the great betrayal. Records can be incomplete, Elena replied evenly, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to resonate through the ancient stones of the hall, especially when those keeping them have reasons to suppress certain truths. Lord Nightshade, a woman whose dark beauty carried hints of cruelty, leaned forward with interest. And what truths might those be, child? Elena's grip tightened on the crown fragments, and as she spoke, her words carried the weight of recovered memory. The truth that House Valeria didn't simply fall to political betrayal, the truth that the last queen chose exile over civil war, and that her daughter was hidden among mortals to preserve the bloodline for a time when unity might be possible again. Even if your heritage is legitimate, Lord Ravenscroft interjected, his tone skeptical, the political landscape has evolved considerably in 8 centuries. The independent houses have no need for a central authority. Darius stepped forward, his own political instincts finally engaging despite his emotional investment. Yet vampire society has been in constant conflict for those same 8 centuries. Territory disputes, resource conflicts, the growing threat from human awareness of our kind, perhaps central authority isn't about need, but about survival. Lord Thornfield, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke. There are reports of rogue vampires acting with unusual coordination, seeking what they call the restoration. If word has spread among the lawless elements that Valerian blood has returned, we face potential uprising. Elena felt a chill at his words, remembering the psychic attack she had endured days earlier. The rogue vampires aren't just searching randomly. They're being directed by someone who knows exactly who I am and what I represent. Which brings us to the central question, Lord Aldrich said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. What exactly do you represent, Elena Valeria? Are you a unifying force returning to heal our fractured society, or are you a catalyst for the very conflicts we've spent centuries learning to manage? Before Elena could respond, the hall's temperature plummeted and shadows deepened despite the blazing firelight. A new voice, cold and familiar, echoed through the chamber with supernatural resonance. She represents the end of your petty squabblings and the beginning of true vampire supremacy. The assembled nobility turned toward the hall's entrance as a figure materialized from the darkness, tall, imposing, with the kind of predatory beauty that marked ancient vampire bloodlines. Elena's pendant flared with warning light as recognition struck her like a physical blow. "Victor," she whispered, memories flooding back with painful clarity. "You were there when my mother's court fell. You were the one who offered your mother a choice between willing alliance and total destruction," Victor finished, his smile revealing fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. "She chose destruction, unfortunately, but you, my dear Elena, will be more reasonable." Darius moved protectively in front of Elena, his own vampiric nature asserting itself in response to the threat. "You have no authority here, Victor. This is neutral ground under ancient law." "Ancient law is precisely what I've come to discuss," Victor replied, producing a scroll of aged parchment. "Specifically, the marriage contract signed between House Valeria and my own bloodline 6 centuries past. A contract that promised Elena Valeria as my bride upon her return to vampire society." The revelation hit the assembled nobility like a thunderclap. Elena felt the crown fragments in her hands grow cold as ice, while the ethereal chains around Darius seemed to tighten with renewed force. "That contract died with the fall of House Valeria," Lord Aldrich declared, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Legal documents of noble houses don't simply expire," Victor countered smoothly. "They remain binding until formally dissolved by proper authority. Since Elena is the last legitimate heir to House Valeria, she also inherits all contractual obligations. Elena stepped around Darius, her own power beginning to manifest as golden light that pushed back against Victor's oppressive darkness. I reject any contract made without my knowledge or consent. Unfortunately, vampire law doesn't recognize individual preference in matters of house alliance, Victor said with false sympathy. Your personal desires are secondary to political necessity. The crown fragments in Elena's hands began to resonate with her emotional turmoil, and around the hall, ancient artifacts responded to her distress. Weapons mounted on the walls hummed with awakening power, while protective wards flickered to life throughout the chamber. However, Victor continued, I'm prepared to offer generous terms. Accept our union willingly, and I'll ensure that Ravenscroft Manor and all who shelter here remain unharmed. Continue to resist, and I fear accidents may befall those you've grown fond of. The threat was clear, and Elena felt Darius's tension spike beside her. Throughout their exchange, she had sensed his internal struggle. Centuries of emotional barriers warring against growing feelings he hadn't expected to experience again. I need time to consider, Elena said carefully, buying space to think while her mind raced through possibilities. Of course, Victor replied with magnanimous cruelty. You have until the blood moon rises tomorrow night. After that, I fear my patience and my protection of your current hosts will expire. As he dissolved back into shadow, leaving the great hall in stunned silence, Elena realized that her choice would determine not only her own fate, but the future of everyone she had come to care about. The hours following Victor's ultimatum passed in tense preparation and whispered counsels, but it was Margaret who provided the key to understanding Elena's true nature. The elderly woman had requested private audience in the manor's ancient chapel, a chamber that predated even Darius's occupation and held artifacts from the earliest days of vampire nobility. There's something I must show you, Margaret said, her voice trembling with the weight of revelation as she led Elena and Darius to a massive mirror that dominated the chapel's eastern wall. The glass was unlike anything either had seen, not silver-backed, but forged from some otherworldly material that seemed to hold depths impossible in ordinary reflection. The soul mirror of truth, she explained, her weathered hands tracing protective symbols in the air. It reveals the true nature of souls, their histories across multiple existences. The Ashford family has guarded it for 6 centuries, waiting for the one who would need to see her complete truth. Elena approached the mirror with growing trepidation, Darius close beside her. As her reflection appeared in the mystical surface, the image began to shift and change, showing not just her current form, but layer upon layer of existence stretching back through time. Look deeper, Margaret urged. See what was, not just what is. Elena placed her palm against the mirror's surface, and the world around them dissolved into swirling mists of memory. When the images solidified, they were standing in the great hall of Ravenscroft Manor, but not as it existed now. This was the hall 8 centuries past, gleaming with fresh construction and filled with celebration. In the center of the scene stood 2 figures locked in an embrace that spoke of deep, abiding love. The man was unmistakably a younger version of Darius, his face carrying hope and joy that the present-day vampire had never shown. The woman in his arms bore Elena's face, but her bearing was that of established nobility, confident in her power and position. That was Elena Valeria Nightshade. Margaret's voice came from somewhere beyond the vision, the last queen of House Valeria and your soul in its previous incarnation. Present-day Elena watched in fascination as her past self and Darius moved through scenes of courtship, bonding ceremony, and profound happiness. The love between them was evident in every gesture, every glance, every moment of shared silence. We were mated, Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her. Truly mated, bonded at the soul level. More than mated, Margaret corrected. You were twin souls, two halves of a complete whole. Such bonds transcend individual lifetimes. The vision shifted, showing darker scenes. Political tensions, whispered conspiracies, and finally the night when everything went wrong. Elena watched her past self make a desperate choice, standing between Darius and a group of attacking vampires, led by a younger version of Victor, sacrificing her life to ensure her mate's survival. I died protecting him, Elena said, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her past self's final moments. I chose his life over mine. And in dying, you triggered something unprecedented, Margaret explained as the vision continued. Your love was so profound, your bond so complete, that death could not sever it. Your soul chose reincarnation, spending 8 centuries finding its way back to him. The mirror showed Elena's soul's journey, lifetimes lived and forgotten, each one bringing her incrementally closer to the vampire world, each death and rebirth guided by the unbreakable connection to Darius. In this life, she had been born with latent vampire abilities, her soul's memory of its true nature bleeding through into mortal existence. The pendant, Darius said, his voice thick with emotion as understanding dawned. It contains the essence of our original bond. Your father commissioned it, Margaret confirmed, after Elena's death. He gathered the remnants of her power, the echoes of your connection, and forged them into an artifact that would recognize her soul's return. It's been waiting 8 centuries for this moment. Elena turned from the mirror to face Darius, seeing in his eyes the recognition of truth that changed everything. You've been alone all this time because you were waiting for me, whether you knew it or not. I thought I was punishing myself for failing to protect you, he admitted, his carefully maintained emotional barriers finally crumbling. I never imagined you would find your way back to me. The revelation recontextualized everything: Elena's immediate comfort in Darius's presence, her instinctive knowledge of vampire customs, her unprecedented powers, and most importantly, the profound connection that had formed between them despite her amnesia. But this also explains Victor's obsession, Margaret continued, her expression growing troubled. He was there when you died, Elena. He was part of the conspiracy that brought down House Valeria, and he spent 8 centuries consolidating power among the rogue elements of vampire society. The marriage contract, Elena realized with growing horror. It wasn't legitimate, was it? No. But Victor has convinced himself that if he can claim you as his mate, he can somehow steal the bond you share with Darius. He believes that possessing the returned Valerian queen will grant him authority over all vampire houses. Darius moved closer to Elena, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. He doesn't understand that true soul bonds can't be transferred or stolen. What we share transcends law, politics, even death itself. Elena leaned into his touch, feeling the rightness of their connection with new clarity. Then we face him together, not as the vampire lord and his mysterious guest, but as the mated pair we've always been. There's more you need to know, Margaret said urgently. Victor isn't working alone. He's gathered followers who believe that claiming the Valerian bloodline will return vampire society to the old ways, where might made right and mortals existed solely as cattle. If he succeeds in his plan, he'll use your name and heritage to justify a war against humanity. The weight of responsibility settled over Elena like a mantle. She was not just reclaiming her personal destiny, but potentially determining the future relationship between vampire and mortal worlds. The crown fragments, she said, pulling them from beneath her cloak where she had carried them. They're not just symbols of royal authority. They're tools of power, aren't they? The crown of Valeria was forged to channel and focus the bloodline's natural abilities, Margaret explained. In the right hands, it can unite vampire houses under a single authority. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon of unprecedented destruction. Elena held the fragments up to the light, watching them pulse with responsive energy. Then Victor can never be allowed to possess them, whatever the cost. Darius took her hands, crowned fragments and all, his expression fierce with protective love. "We won't let that happen. But you need to understand what completing the crown means. You'll become the most powerful vampire in existence, with the ability to command loyalty from any of our kind. That level of power changes people." "Not if I remember what I'm fighting for," Elena replied, her voice carrying new strength and certainty. "I spent 8 centuries finding my way back to you, Darius. I'm not going to let power or politics or Victor's ambitions destroy that." As if responding to her words, the crown fragments began to resonate with harmonious tones, their separate pieces yearning to become whole. Around them, the soul mirror reflected not just their current forms, but the destined future they were meant to claim together if they could survive the trials that awaited them. The blood moon would rise in mere hours, and with it, Victor's deadline. But now, Elena faced that confrontation with full knowledge of who she truly was, what she meant to Darius, and the scope of the forces arrayed against them. The last daughter of House Valeria had returned, and she would not be claimed by anyone save the mate her soul had spent lifetimes seeking. The blood moon began its rise as Elena and Darius stood together in the deepest vaults beneath Ravenscroft Manor, their hands clasped around the 7 crown fragments, while golden light pulsed between their joined fingers. The ancient chambers had not been disturbed for centuries, but tonight they thrummed with awakening power as artifact after artifact responded to Elena's presence. "The bonding must be completed before we face Victor," Darius said, his voice carrying both tenderness and urgency. "If we're to fight as true mates, our souls need to be fully united in this lifetime." Elena nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate through the fragments of memory that had returned to her. "I remember the ceremony from before, how we joined our essences, became something greater than either of us alone." Around them, the vault revealed treasures accumulated across 8 centuries of Blackmoor leadership, ancient weapons forged in supernatural fires, protective amulets crafted by the greatest vampire artisans, and most significantly, the Phoenix Blade, a legendary sword that materialized from shadow and flame only for true mates fighting in perfect unity. "The blade chooses its wielders," Darius explained as they approached the ethereal weapon. "It cannot be lifted by those acting from individual will alone." Elena reached toward the sword's hilt, feeling Darius's presence merge with hers as their joined hands grasped the weapon. The Phoenix Blade solidified under their combined touch, its surface gleaming with inscriptions that told the history of great loves that had transcended death itself. "It recognizes us," Elena whispered in wonder as the blade's weight distributed perfectly between them. "Even across centuries, even through death and rebirth, it knows we belong together." Their intimate moment was interrupted by Marcus's urgent arrival, his weathered face grave with worry. "My lord, forgive the intrusion, but we have developments that require immediate attention." Darius and Elena followed him from the vaults, the Phoenix Blade remaining solid in their joined grasp. In the great hall above, they found an assembly that would have been impossible to imagine days earlier. Representatives from major vampire houses standing alongside mortal allies who had arrived under cover of darkness. "Lord Aldrich has declared for you," Celeste reported, her usual composure brightened by hope. "Houses Ravenscroft and Thornfield have followed his lead. They're prepared to recognize your authority as the returned Valerian queen." Elena felt the weight of royal responsibility settling around her shoulders, but tempered now by the certainty of Darius's support and the growing understanding of her true purpose. "And House Nightshade." "Lady Nightshade." "Departed an hour ago," Lord Aldrich replied, his silver hair catching the firelight as he bowed formally. "She claimed neutrality, but her direction suggests she may be reporting to Victor about our preparations." "Then he'll know we're ready for him," Darius observed, his tactical mind already calculating the implications. "He'll adjust his approach accordingly." Margaret stepped forward from among the mortal allies, her arms carrying a bundle wrapped in ancient silk. "There's something else you need to see," she said, unwrapping the contents to reveal 3 additional crown fragments, pieces that pulsed with the same energy as those Elena carried. "These were hidden in the Ashford family vaults," Margaret explained. 10 fragments in total comprise the complete crown of Valeria. 7 you already possess. These 3 complete the set. Elena accepted the additional fragments, gasping as their combined power sent waves of memory and knowledge coursing through her consciousness. Images flashed before her eyes, vampire courts in harmonious assembly, treaties that had maintained peace for generations, the great works of art and scholarship that had flourished under unified leadership. The crown doesn't just grant authority, she realized, her voice carrying new depth of understanding. It represents the choice between unity and division, between cooperation and endless conflict. As she spoke, the 10 fragments began to move of their own accord, rising from her hands to orbit slowly around her head. Where each piece settled, it fused with its neighbors until the complete crown of Valeria materialized, silver and sapphire, wrought into intricate patterns that seemed to hold the very essence of starlight. "Elena," Darius whispered, seeing her not just as the woman who had awakened in his chambers, but as the queen she had always been destined to become. The crown's completion sent a pulse of power throughout the manor and beyond, announcing to every vampire, within 100 miles, that the Valerian bloodline had returned to claim its heritage. But the energy also carried a more personal message. Elena's acceptance of her role as both queen and mate, united with Darius in purpose as they had been centuries before. "Victor will feel that," Lord Aldrich observed, with grim satisfaction. "He'll know that his window for easy victory has closed." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the manor's protective wards began to flicker and strain under external pressure. Through the tall windows, they could see unnatural darkness gathering around Ravenscroft's perimeter, not the gentle darkness of night, but the oppressive shadow that accompanied powerful vampire magic. "He's brought an army," Celeste reported, her enhanced senses reading the approaching threat. "At least 24 vampires, plus human thralls to serve as cannon fodder." Elena rose from where she had been kneeling, the crown settling naturally on her brow, as though it had never been elsewhere. In her bearing was the authority of 8 centuries of noble heritage, but in her eyes was the love that had transcended death itself. "Then we meet them as we are," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "United in purpose, strengthened by alliance, and fighting for the future we choose rather than the past we're fleeing from." Darius moved to stand beside her, the phoenix blades solid and ready in their joined grasp. Around them, vampire nobility and mortal allies alike took positions according to a defensive plan that seemed to form naturally from Elena's tactical knowledge and Darius's centuries of experience. "There's something else," Margaret added quietly, approaching Elena with obvious reverence. "The crown's completion has awakened abilities that were dormant even in your previous life. You're not just the returned queen, you're the evolved queen, shaped by centuries of growth that death could not interrupt," Elena felt. The truth of those words, as power beyond anything she had previously experienced, flowed through her consciousness. She could sense every vampire within miles, feel their individual natures and allegiances, understand their fears and desires as clearly as her own. More importantly, she could influence those who chose to accept her authority, offering strength and clarity to those who would stand with her. "Victor's vampires aren't all willing followers," she realized, her awareness expanding to encompass the approaching army. Many serve him from fear rather than loyalty. They can be turned if offered a better choice. But first, we must survive his initial assault, Darius reminded her, his warrior's instincts sharp, despite the emotional upheaval of the evening. He'll want to break our defenses quickly, before word of your return spreads beyond our immediate allies. The blood moon reached its zenith, casting crimson light through the great hall's windows as Victor's forces took positions around the manor. In the distance, his voice carried on supernatural winds, amplified by dark magic that made the very stones tremble. Elena Valeria, his words echoed through the night. You have until the moon begins its descent to surrender yourself and the crown to my custody. Refuse, and everyone who shelters you will die slowly enough to savor their suffering. Elena's response came not in words, but in a pulse of golden power that strengthened every defensive ward around Ravenscroft Manor, while simultaneously reaching out to touch the minds of Victor's reluctant followers. Her message was simple. Choose unity over domination, hope over fear, the future over the past. Several vampires in Victor's force wavered as her influence touched them, and in that moment of hesitation, Elena knew that the battle's outcome would depend not just on strength, but on the power of connection to overcome the isolation that had defined vampire society for too long. The final confrontation was about to begin. Victor's assault began with overwhelming supernatural force as darkness crashed against Ravenscroft's ancient wards like a tide of malevolent energy. The manor's protective barriers, strengthened by 8 centuries of Blackmoor power, held against the initial onslaught, but strained visibly under the coordinated attack of 24 vampires, led by their corrupted master. Elena stood in the great hall's center, the crown of Valeria blazing with golden light that pushed back against Victor's oppressive shadows. In her joined grasp with Darius, the phoenix blade hummed with eager anticipation, its ethereal metal solid and ready for the battle that would determine vampire society's future. The eastern ward is failing, Celeste reported from her position at the tall windows, her enhanced senses tracking the magical assault. Victor's concentrated his strongest followers there. Through the crown's expanded awareness, Elena felt each breach in their defenses like a physical wound. But she also sensed something Victor had not anticipated. Several of his reluctant followers were already wavering, their allegiance shaken by her earlier mental touch and the obvious righteousness of her cause. "He's using the blood moon orb," Lord Aldrich observed grimly, pointing toward a crimson crystal visible through the shattered eastern windows. The artifact pulsed with dark energy, amplifying Victor's natural abilities to unnatural levels. That relic was banned centuries ago for good reason. It corrupts everything it touches. The first breach came suddenly, as Victor's forces shattered the eastern ward and poured through the gap like a flood of shadow and fang. Elena and Darius moved as one, the phoenix blade singing through the air as they met the assault with coordinated grace that spoke of centuries of partnership. Their combined fighting style was poetry in motion, Elena's newly awakened Valerian powers complementing Darius's warrior experience in perfect harmony. Where she channeled golden energy to blind and disorient their enemies, he struck with lethal precision. Where his strength faltered against overwhelming numbers, her power restored him. Together, Darius murmured as they carved through the first wave of attackers, "We're stronger than we ever were apart." But Victor had anticipated their unity. As Elena and Darius fought their way toward the great hall's center, the ancient vampire lord appeared through a cloud of supernatural mist, his own power grotesquely amplified by the blood moon orb's dark influence. "How touching," Victor sneered, his voice carrying undertones that made the very air vibrate with menace. The reunited lovers, dancing their way to mutual destruction. He struck with speed that defied even vampire reflexes, his corrupted strength sending Darius crashing into the stone wall with bone-crushing force. The phoenix blade flickered and nearly dissolved as their connection was violently severed. Elena cried out as she felt Darius's pain through their soul bond, her power surging wildly in response to his injury. Golden energy exploded outward from her position, driving back several of Victor's followers, while simultaneously strengthening the manor's failing defenses. "You cannot have him," she declared, moving protectively over Darius's wounded form. The crown on her brow blazed with light that made Victor shield his eyes despite his enhanced power. "Our bond transcends death itself. It certainly transcends your pathetic ambitions." Victor's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp with centuries of accumulated bitterness. "Bonds can be broken, little queen. Watch as I demonstrate." He raised the blood moon orb, its crimson light focusing into a beam of pure corruption aimed at the connection between Elena and Darius. The attack struck like acid against their soul bond, and both vampires screamed as agony beyond physical pain tore through their joined consciousness. For a terrifying moment, Elena felt their connection wavering, the bond that had survived death itself straining under Victor's assault. But then Darius's hand found hers, and the phoenix blade solidified between their interlocked fingers with renewed strength. "You understand nothing," Darius gasped, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. "True bonds aren't chains to be broken, they're foundations that become stronger under pressure." Elena helped him stand, their combined will manifesting as a shield of golden light that deflected Victor's continued attacks. Around the Great Hall, the battle had reached a stalemate. Victor's forces were stronger individually, but Elena's growing influence had turned several of his reluctant followers, creating chaos in his ranks. The orb, Elena realized, studying Victor's power source through the crown's enhanced perception. It's not just amplifying his abilities, it's slowly consuming him. He's becoming something less than vampire, more like a creature of pure malevolence. Darius's tactical mind seized on the implications. Then his power has limits, even if they're higher than ours. We need to force him to exhaust himself before the corruption makes him unstoppable. As if hearing their whispered strategy, Victor abandoned subtlety and threw himself directly at them. The blood moon orb's power making his attacks devastating but increasingly erratic. Elena and Darius met his assault together, the phoenix blade weaving patterns of light and shadow as they fought to survive against an enemy whose strength seemed to grow with each passing moment. The Great Hall shook under the force of their supernatural battle, centuries-old stones cracking as powers beyond mortal comprehension clashed in the space where vampire nobility had once gathered in peace. The outcome remained uncertain, but one thing had become clear: only one vision of vampire society's future would survive this night. The Great Hall had become a battlefield of supernatural forces as Elena faced Victor in the confrontation that would determine vampire society's destiny. Around them, the remnants of both armies watched in tense silence, understanding that this single combat would decide everything. Victor raised the blood moon orb, its crimson radiance casting twisted shadows across his features as corruption spread visibly through his form. "You still don't understand the gift I'm offering you," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of power beyond natural vampire abilities. "Accept our union, and together we can remake this world in our image, vampires ruling openly, mortals serving as they were meant to." Elena felt the dark allure of his vision, the seductive pull of absolute power that the heart of eternity, her royal birthright, could provide if she embraced its darker possibilities. The gem pulsed at her throat, offering strength that could overwhelm Victor's corrupted abilities, but at the cost of her soul's integrity. "Power without compassion isn't strength," she replied, her voice carrying the authority of 8 centuries of royal heritage. "It's just another form of weakness." Behind her, Darius struggled to rise despite his injuries, his presence a steady anchor that reminded Elena of what truly mattered. Through their soul bond, she felt his unwavering faith in her ability to choose correctly, even when faced with impossible odds. Victor's patience finally shattered. He launched himself at Elena with the blood moon orb's full power behind his attack, darkness and corruption flowing from him like a poisonous tide. Elena met his assault not with matching darkness, but with the pure golden light of Valerian heritage, focused through love rather than domination. Their powers clashed in the center of the great hall, creating a maelstrom of conflicting energies that made the ancient stones groan under supernatural stress. For a moment, Victor's corrupted strength seemed overwhelming, pressing Elena back despite her royal abilities. Then Darius was beside her, his injured form somehow finding the strength to grasp the phoenix blade's hilt alongside hers. The legendary weapon blazed with renewed power as their united will flowed through its ethereal metal, pushing back against Victor's assault. Together, Darius whispered, his voice carrying across centuries of separation and reunion. Forever, Elena completed, their bond strengthening beyond what either had achieved alone. The Phoenix Blade became a conduit for their combined essence, channeling not just Elena's royal power or Darius's warrior strength, but the transcendent force of love that had survived death itself. The golden energy that flowed from their united grasp was unlike anything Victor had encountered, not the cold fire of dominion, but the warm light of connection and hope. Victor's corruption began to unravel under the assault of pure love. The blood moon orbs, dark influence which fed on isolation and fear, found no purchase against the united strength of true mates. His enhanced abilities faltered as the artifact's power turned against itself, consuming the very corruption it had created. "This isn't possible," Victor snarled, his form flickering between vampire nobility and something far more twisted. "Power is meant to be taken, not shared." "You never understood," Elena replied, the crown of Valeria blazing with light that reached every corner of the great hall. "True power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." As she spoke, her influence expanded beyond the immediate battle, touching every vampire present with the possibility of unity over division. Victor's remaining followers felt the call of their better natures, remembering what vampire society could be when guided by wisdom rather than fear. One by one, they laid down their arms, choosing Elena's vision of cooperation over Victor's promise of dominion. The ancient vampire lord found himself alone, his power sourced entirely from the increasingly unstable blood moon orb. "If I cannot rule," Victor declared with desperate fury, "then I'll ensure no one else can either." He shattered the blood moon orb against the hall's stone floor, releasing centuries of accumulated dark energy in one catastrophic burst. The explosion of corrupted power threatened to consume everything within miles, turning victory into mutual annihilation. But Elena had made her choice. Instead of using the Heart of Eternity to shield herself and Darius, she channeled its power outward, creating a protective barrier around every person in the Great Hall, ally and former enemy alike. The royal gem's pure energy absorbed and transformed Victor's corruption, turning destruction into healing light. Victor himself was caught at the center of his own dark explosion, his form dissolving as the corruption he had embraced finally consumed him completely. His last expression was not rage, but surprise, as though he finally understood what he had thrown away in his pursuit of empty power. As the supernatural energies settled, Elena collapsed into Darius's arms, the effort of protecting everyone having drained even her royal abilities. Around them, vampire nobles and former enemies alike knelt in recognition of what she had accomplished. "It's finished," she whispered against Darius's chest, feeling the peace that came with conflicts resolved and futures made possible. "No," he replied, his voice full of love and wonder. "It's just beginning." The crown of Valeria pulsed with gentle light, no longer a symbol of individual power, but a beacon of unity that would guide vampire society into an age of cooperation they had not known for centuries. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Ravenscroft Manor bore little resemblance to the fortress of solitude it had been for 8 centuries. The ancient stones still stood strong, but they no longer held secrets behind walls of isolation. Instead, they sheltered something unprecedented in vampire society, a court built on cooperation rather than fear, where representatives from major houses gathered not to scheme against one another, but to build a future worthy of their immortal heritage. Elena walked through the manor's transformed halls, the crown of Valeria resting lightly on her brow as she reviewed the morning's correspondence. Letters arrived daily from vampire communities across the world, all seeking guidance on implementing the new accords that promised an end to centuries of territorial conflicts. The crown's power had evolved beyond mere authority. It had become a symbol of the unity that was slowly healing their fractured society. In the great hall, she found Darius overseeing the installation of a new addition to their ancestral gallery, a portrait that captured them as they were now, united not just as mates, but as partners in the work of art. Transformation. The artist, a vampire from House Thornfield, with a gift for seeing souls rather than mere appearances, had somehow captured the love that transcended lifetimes in their painted expressions. "Lord Aldrich's latest report arrived this morning," Elena said, settling beside Darius on the restored seating that now accommodated visiting dignitaries from across vampire society. "The territorial disputes in the eastern provinces have been resolved through mediation rather than warfare. It's the first time in 2 centuries that neighboring houses have reached accord without bloodshed." Darius smiled, his expression carrying a peace that 800 years of isolation had never provided. When vampires remember that they share common interests, cooperation becomes possible again. Your influence has reminded them what unity feels like. Through the tall windows, they could see the manor's gardens where another symbol of their transformation grew, the eternal rose, a flower that bloomed only for true mates, had appeared spontaneously in the courtyard 3 days after Victor's defeat. Its silver petals caught the afternoon light like captured starlight, a living testament to love that endured beyond death itself. Margaret sends word from the Ashford archives. Elena continued, sorting through the morning's messages. The historical records are being compiled into a comprehensive library that will preserve the true stories of vampire nobility for future generations. No more hidden knowledge, no more deliberate gaps that allowed fear to flourish where understanding should have grown. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Celeste's arrival, her arms laden with documents that represented the ongoing work of rebuilding vampire society from its foundations. "The wedding preparations are nearly complete," she announced with obvious satisfaction. "Representatives from every major house have confirmed their attendance, and several minor houses are sending delegates despite the distances involved." Elena felt a flutter of anticipation at the mention of their upcoming ceremony. Though they were already bonded at the soul level, the formal recognition of their union would serve a larger purpose, demonstrating to vampire society that their new order was built on partnership rather than domination. "The traditions you've chosen blend the old customs with new meaning," Celeste continued. "Ancient vows spoken with modern understanding, ceremonies that honor heritage while embracing change." "Speaking of change," Darius said, gesturing toward a particular document among Celeste's papers, "the proposal for formal cooperation protocols with human governments has received preliminary approval from 3 national councils. It seems our new approach to mortal relations is gaining acceptance beyond vampire society." Elena nodded, remembering the careful negotiations that had followed her decision to reach out to mortal authorities. rather than maintain the ancient pretense that humans were unaware of vampire existence. Trust, it turned out, fostered better results than deception, even when the truth was difficult to accept. A gentle knock at the great hall's entrance announced Thomas's arrival. The young servant, who had nearly died from mysterious illness weeks earlier, now stood healthy and strong, his recovery a testament to Elena's healing abilities and the manor's transformation from a place of isolation to one of genuine care. "My lady, my lord," he said with the easy familiarity that characterized relationships throughout their household, "the first guests for tonight's celebration have arrived. Lord Ravenscroft's delegation brings gifts and formal recognition of the new accords. Tonight would mark the official announcement of their wedding date, but more importantly, it would celebrate the transformation of vampire society from centuries of conflict to an era of cooperation." Elena had chosen to mark this transition not with displays of power, but with expressions of hope. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the great hall filled with vampire nobility who had once viewed one another as rivals or threats. Now they gathered as allies united by common purpose. Their conversations focused on shared challenges rather than individual advantages. Elena moved among them with Darius at her side, the crown's influence facilitating understanding between groups that had been estranged for generations. "You've given us something we had forgotten was possible," Lord Aldrich said during a quiet moment in their evening's conversations. "Not just peace, but the memory of why peace is worth pursuing." Elena accepted his words with the gracious authority that had become second nature, but her eyes found Darius's across the crowded hall. In his gaze, she saw not the feared vampire lord who had ruled through careful isolation, but the partner who had waited 8 centuries for her return and who would stand beside her through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the celebration continued around them, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had awakened in these halls with no memory of her past, carrying only a pendant that glowed in the presence of a stranger. Now she wore the crown of Valeria, and the certainty that love, once found, was worth any sacrifice to preserve. The eternal rose in their garden would bloom for as long as their bond endured, and their bond, tested by death itself, promised to endure for all the centuries yet to come. Together, they had transformed not just their own destiny, but the destiny of their entire kind, proving that even immortal hearts could learn to hope again.